Hi, this is Andrew Sears, and in this lecture, I'm going to talk about how worldview and epistemology frame social problems and solutions. Now, as I look at different organizations, they come up with very different solutions. And what's interesting is if you actually look at their worldview assumptions, um, a lot of the different solutions that they come up with are largely dependent on these worldview assumptions. So that's kind of the point of this talk. So let's talk about first, what is a worldview? A worldview is a comprehensive lens through which we see and make sense of the world. In many ways, it's big picture beliefs and assumptions on the world. It gets into a lot of philosophical terms, theology, so epistemology, so how we determine truth, metaphysics, how we perceive the nature of reality, anthropology, how we define who we are as people. So those assumptions are huge, and they really shape a lot of how we create organizations and how we address problems. So here are some key points about worldview. There's lots of Christian books about worldview. It's a really useful concept. It has some limitations also, so I want to talk about that. So one of the big limitations is it's important to recognize the distinction between espoused worldview and an acted worldview. An acted worldview often has strong unconscious and cultural influences. And often discussions on worldview overly focus on having the right, I would say, checklist of what you would call Christian espoused worldview assumptions while downplaying an acted worldview. So, I'll just use one example. You might believe that there's a loving God and that he cares for you, but if you have a deep background of abuse or trauma, you may not feel like there's that the world's safe. And so you have this espoused worldview of, that God's loving and the world's safe, but deep down, you don't necessarily feel that. So that's just one example. There's a whole lot of other examples you can bring from culture. And in many ways, I think that worldview can be understood as a cognitively or a head-focused view of culture. I believe that culture, I like using cultural frameworks more often because I believe that they're more comprehensive. Having said that, the idea of worldview is still super helpful, but I want to explain some of its strengths and weaknesses. So I'd also like to talk about how just the fallen nature of the world and how the idea of original sin creates worldview and culture war. So one of the assumptions of Christianity is that everything is fallen, and there's ways that gets played out. So let me just explain how that gets played out in terms of worldview and culture war. So every field applies methodologies, so science, social science, theology, that they rely on philosophical assumptions to make them effective. In many ways, the whole scientific method, what it's doing is it's taking some assumptions that's simplifying the view of the world. And if you take this simplified view of the world, then you can do some amazing things. And it's had amazing results. It saved billions of lives over the past few centuries. And it uses different tools. So empirical is where you're going to do experiments. Positivistic means that you need to try to find things that you can prove or close to prove. And then naturalism is you're going to focus on what you can observe in nature. You're not going to try to focus on the supernatural. Now, these are all great assumptions for a methodology. It's no different than saying I'm going to use Excel spreadsheet. Excel spreadsheet just deals with numbers. It's not the best thing to write a paper. It's not the best thing to create videos with. It's a tool. Recognizing science as a tool and having methodological assumptions just makes a lot of sense. Now, here's where things go bad, is that often the philosophical assumptions needed for a methodology like science become ingrained as a worldview. And they start to answer questions that science was never meant to answer, and that becomes scientism, where science essentially becomes a worldview or religion. Now, and this requires a much longer conversation, and I could have a whole paper on this. But if you study the field of media ecology, the idea is that every tool we use, every technology we use has an effect on us. So every methodology we use is a tool. And what it's doing is it's building our mental muscles to perceive the world through that worldview. I'll just use an example. If I've been spending my whole day working in Excel spreadsheets and just trying to solve problems, and someone comes to me with an emotional issue to talk through, my brain is in a problem-solving mode. I often respond like, often guys over-respond trying to just solve the problem. Sometimes people just want to listen. So that's just a small example. But the idea is, as we are, using these tools, it's affecting our mental muscles, and we can't have, whenever it's building our mental muscles, it's affecting our enacted worldview unconsciously. We can't really control that. For example, as a Christian practicing science, it will unconsciously shape your worldview. As a counselor practicing counseling in a secular environment, it's gonna, and going through secular training, it's gonna unconsciously shape your worldview. There's just no way around it. That's not to say that we shouldn't go use those tools or use that training. Just like, if I use Excel, it might make me very focused on numbers and problem solving. But it does, we have to recognize that there's things that we need to do to get out of that mindset, so to speak. Now, here's the last point, and this is what creates the culture wars. So to build great cultures and great institutions requires collecting people together who specialize in using a particular methodology. So the best scientific institutions in the world have collected the best scientists in the world. But what that does is it creates a type of groupthink where the methodologies become ingrained as worldview. So, just use an example, and this is, one of the groupthinks of academia. You get a bunch of smart people together, and these are people who are strong cognitively. They are going to emphasize cognitive dimensions on a lot of things. So that's just one example, and that creates a worldview. And what this does over time is this creates worldview or culture wars. So, academia then goes to a worldview of scientism, and then the church goes to a worldview of biblicism. And that, the idea of biblicism is that the Bible is the source of 100% of truth, and to a certain extent becomes worshiping the Bible, replacing God with the Bible. The Bible is, foundational for our faith, right? But the Bible is not God. So here's the problem. Besides the culture war problem, is that we have real problems that we got to solve. We have, people's lives that we need to help them transform. A lot of our partners are working with people who are homeless, people who are recovering from addiction, and these require multiple lenses and methods. So so all that was a preamble, but let me get into distinguishing Christian and secular worldview. So whenever I said the big picture assumption, so you got a Christian worldview, a secular science worldview. So there's the base worldview, and we're just going to call it Christian worldview, and secular scientific naturalism. Now, then you have a dominant meta-narrative. So the dominant Christian meta-narrative is you had creation, then you had the fall, and then Jesus came, you had the redemption, and then you have restoration. We're in the middle of that now, but then it will ultimately be fulfilled with Jesus coming back. And then the dominant meta-narrative, I would say, in the secular science worldview is, that we came from cosmic chance. And right now the dominant meta-narrative is that we're going to end in ecological catastrophe unless something changes. Then you have epistemology, and there's various epistemologies in the Christian worldview. You got the whole theological pyramid, but in this course we're using the Wesleyan quadrilateral as one of the main tools. And the secular science worldview what you're using is empirical positivic naturalism. So it's experiments, things that can be proven or disproven, and focused on natural phenomena, not necessarily supernatural. And the problem is that you start with a methodology, and this is great methodology, but it becomes a worldview over time. So then you get into the question of this is philosophical anthropology. So who are we? And in particular on that, it's what are we going to emphasize? So for Christians, it's we're in God's image but fallen, and we're holistic social people. Whereas secular social science is thinking animals, collection of atoms, and often who we are is provided by the field. So if you're in psychology, there's going to be psychological answers to that. If you're in sociology, there's sociological, economics. Each field is going to have different ways of defining that. Then there's kind of the question of what's the fundamental problem. For Christians, this is sin, and taking more of a holistic understanding of sin. Whereas in secular science, it's going to be provided by the field. So, for example, in psychology, it's psychopathology. Then the solution, what is health? For Christians, it's salvation, and what I would describe as holistic spiritual growth. That in salvation we are saved in an instant, but we are continually being sanctified or saved, and we'll be fully sanctified once we go to heaven. And then in secular science, there's provided by the field. So there's definitions of what is psychological health. And then there's a question of how should I live? So, Jesus summarized that for Christians, it's love God and love others. The dominant, answer to this is individual pleasure maximizing or self-actualization, which, one of the challenges of that term is it means a lot of different things to different people. And then that gets into the values. So, where are your values? In the Christian worldview, it's Bible-based. In secular science, it's relativistic. And it pretends falsely to be values-free. Now, here's kind of two main points I want to make and on both of these. One is that this secular science worldview, that's not science. That's philosophical assumptions that science uses that should only be applied as methodology, but instead are being applied, if you want to say, I want to use a tool, empirical positivic naturalism, that's using a tool. But applying that tool to the whole world is kind of like saying, I'm going to use a spreadsheet, and then everything in the world that I'm going to decide about what exists in the world is going to be based on what I can put in a spreadsheet. That's just not a good way to live. But then on the Christian side, really the main challenge is I just think that this leads us to become arrogant because we say, look, I'm better than you. I have the right espoused worldview checklist, but none of us have the right enacted worldview. Because every one of these things, are we really living like we have been fully redeemed? Are we really living like we understand the depths of our fall and our sin? Are we, really loving God? Are we loving others? These are things that we strive for. So that's one way of framing, Christian versus secular worldview. Now, what's the point of all this? Well, we work with a lot of organizations that serve, individuals that are homeless and people recovering from addiction. And these worldview assumptions have huge implications on the approach that you take to things like how life transformation happens. Now, what I'd like to do is go through, there's been 4 phases of evolution on thinking about how life transformation happens, and they really relate to the philosophical and epistemological, how we determine truth framework. So you start with this modernist, rational, secular, and individualistic framework. And this is really the framework of psychology. So then you get to the question of who are we? And that's in the domain of philosophical anthropology. And so, psychology has provided some really great tools. So, you get to the question of how life transformation happens. In psychology and psychological theories and skills in clinical counseling, basically is if you can have a very skilled clinical counselor applying theories effectively, then you can bring life transformation. And, the great thing that psychology has provided is it's applying science to the mind, behavior, and counseling. And honestly, that's been revolutionary. It's been huge, very valuable. Having said that, it's limited. Now, one point I'd like to make is that I come across a lot of Christians who are trained at secular schools. They have built deep muscles in largely a secular worldview. That doesn't mean that, that they're going to live entirely by a secular worldview, but they have to develop muscles in other aspects. So what are those other aspects of building that up? Well, a lot of the books that we use in our courses will combine theological perspectives. So here, what you're adding, and this is really what the field of Christian counseling has added, is you're saying that there's answers to all these questions. So, but there's also theological answers. So let's combine what we learn from psychology, but also combine that with theology. Now, I put the word head here, and that most of this is taught in academia. And as I talked about, academia gets a lot of smart people who are cognitively focused, and they give cognitive answers to things. So it's very head focused. So how life transformation happens is you combine psychological theory and skills in clinical counseling, but you also need to adopt correct theology and Christian worldview. And then what you're doing is you're applying Christian worldview to counseling and psychology. Now, if you read most of the books in this space, that's what this is, what they're going to be teaching, is how do you apply theology and Christian worldview to the field of counseling. Now, that's also limited because it's very focused on the head. So then the next wave, in one of the books that we use in our counseling and life transformation course, really emphasizes in a lot of Christian circles, there's been a strong emphasis over the past several decades on spiritual formation and spiritual discipline. So Richard Foster and Dallas Willard are big on that. And there, what you're saying is, no, we are beyond just the head. We can't just focus on the cognitive side. So we need to have more of a holistic approach. And we're going to think about the head, the heart, and the will, and the hands. And a lot of what the spiritual formation is emphasizing is saying, actually, no, we need to do some things. We need to actually do spiritual disciplines, and that's how change is going to happen. So that's really what the life transformation is. And it recognizes the importance of spiritual discipline. So each one of these, by combining these perspectives, we're getting a deeper understanding on how do you bring life transformation. So, and I've seen a lot of ministries over time, usually they'll start with getting the right theology. And I see some ministries that's all they're doing is they're teaching right theology. Well, you need to be teaching, and, they'll minor on spiritual disciplines, but, all these things can be helpful. Now, recently I did a survey for a lot of our partners, and I asked, what resources would you recommend? And for the first time ever, I had probably 5 different people say, there's this book that has been completely changed, a game changer for us in terms of ministry. And it was called The Other Half of Church. And what that book really added is it said that, no, we are not just individuals. We are social people. The framework is we have to be focused on community, recognizing that Christianity is a team sport. Christianity is not an individual sport. And what it does is, this book, The Other Half of Church, emphasizes is that even from both the field of psychology and social psychology and the Bible, really emphasizes that most of the change happens in community and relationship. So here, what you're doing in Who Are We is, it's not just head, heart, and hands, which was an improvement on the previous model, but it's community centered. And really the emphasis there is, and I believe this is true, that the biggest impact on life transformation happens from deep relationships in a healthy Christian community. So, if, and this has just been kind of my experience, you take someone who has been in an unsafe environment their whole life and they've experienced all sorts of trauma. Well, you can teach them all sorts of theory about, the correct worldview, the correct theology. They can do spiritual disciplines, but how they get to a safer spot, how they get to not be hypervigilant, how they get healing is deep, healthy relationships that are safe. And there, really, the main point is that life transformation is more caught than taught, or even, contrasted with the spiritual formation of spiritual discipline, or willed. The guy who wrote this book, The Other Half of Church, he tried to apply the spiritual disciplines in his church, and he found that for half the people, it wasn't working because they just couldn't do the willpower. But if he could get them in community, then the transformation was happening. So that's another way of looking at how the philosophy of who we are and our understanding affects how we approach, solving problems, with our clients. Now, I want to provide another framework, and this is how I had, framed the different academic disciplines. So you have four main domains: humanities, social sciences, science and technology, the cultural disciplines, and the social sciences. And I'm not going to go into all this because I've covered this in other presentations, but each of these is going to give different answers to understanding a problem. So let's just take a problem like addiction, and you can take this individual framework and the internal side, and then you can take the collective and the external, and each of these quadrants will give different answers. So let's take a Christian systems approach to understanding the causes of addiction, all four quadrants. So this is what we need to be doing, is we need to be using all of these. So on the internal individual, so what are the causes of addiction? If someone's unemployed, often there's a higher correlation. If they don't have good emotional intelligence, if they have personal isolation, broken relationships, if they have spiritual emptiness, wounds from abuse, separation from God, those are all driving factors for causes of addiction. And if you're trying to solve, help someone recover from addiction, you have to address these different problems. Then you get other emphases. So there's the biochemistry of addiction. You have medical treatments. If someone has severe depression and they need some, medication for that or whatever, that's definitely going to be better than self-medicating using, illegal drugs. There's hereditary predisposition towards addiction. There's, just having easy access to drugs and addiction. So if you live in a flop house or you live in a neighborhood where everyone's using, I worked at a Burger King where everyone was on drugs at the Burger King. Then you have other things, lack of physical care of your body. So, if you are unhealthy, that may cause you to be more depressed. Being more depressed might make you, drive you more to addiction. And then you have biophysical, emotional predisposition. And then you have other factors. So cultural devaluation of emotion, spirituality, relationships, subcultures where addiction's the norm, drugs, alcohol, sex, food, materialism promoted in mass media. There's current cultural oppression from racism and other factors. There's cultural inheritance from past oppression. A lot of the groups that have experienced the most oppression have the highest rates of addiction. And then you have worship of sex, hedonism, and other gods that permeate culture. And then you have society, breakdown of family, lack of jobs, systemic oppression, political priorities that might hurt people, economics of the drug trade, global exploitation, failed states, globalization of crime. Now, all of these disciplines can be interpreted through a Christian worldview. So each of these can be interpreted through a Christian worldview. So then you get to solutions. So a Christian holistic approach for treating addiction, get a job, get counseling, healthy relationships, help people form their identity. There's the physical components, there's cultural components, and then there's societal components. And, the idea is that Christian faith and dependence on God is the organizing paradigm for all of these things. So this is a Christian holistic approach to treating addiction. Now, worldview has huge implications for this and philosophical assumptions. So let's just take the idea of scientific positivism. So what does scientific positivism do? Well, positivism by its nature, it can only focus on things that can be proven quantitatively, essentially. So all the internal dimensions of, how you feel and how you describe that. Now you can show that externally, using, different ways to measure that, but the whole internal dimension basically doesn't exist for a secular scientific positivism. So then you get to, okay, if you have that worldview, and then you apply that worldview to something like a problem of overdose deaths, then you really only can come up with, certain strategies. So your worldview is dictating your strategy, and that's really the harm reduction strategy. So the harm reduction idea is that, you have people who are addicted to opioids. So, harm reduction is you get them on, essentially addicted to something else that is less likely for them to die from. So methadone, Narcan's great. That's not, any issue. But then you have medication assisted treatment. So other forms of medication assisted treatment. And then you might have other social programs. So that's, cities have tried having safe injection sites and other safe alternative to opioids. You end up with and I think here's the important point is someone can look at this and say, well, science is proving that these are the best treatments. Well, if you apply the scientific assumption, the assumptions of science, then you're excluding all of these holistic solutions, because the lens that you're using, you're essentially saying this doesn't fit into my Excel spreadsheet. I can't, use this because I'm using a tool. So let's get into what this looks like in organization. So you take differences between, say, a rescue mission and a secular homeless shelter. So you have a holistic Christian worldview versus secular scientific positivism. The practical theology is a Christian holistic approach, or the Wesleyan quadrilateral. And in the practical theology that they're applying here, I would call is quantitative best practices in harm reduction. So what's the fundamental problem? This holistic Christian 4-quadrant that I showed you before. And then the fundamental problem is physical. So it's a lack of housing and overdose death. So you're only looking at the physical aspects of the problem. And then the solution, the Christian solution was salvation plus the holistic needs across all 4 quadrants, whereas the secular homeless shelter is going to focus on physical interventions. And, if you have assumptions that only focus on the physical, you're going to have solutions that only focus on the physical. So housing plus medical solutions. So then who you serve, anyone, and I'm not saying all rescue missions are going to be dry shelters, but often rescue missions are dry shelters, meaning people can't be drunk whenever they come in there. And, so that might be the shelter part. And then you might have a residential recovery program where you're essentially assessing, is someone ready for change? Here you might have a low barrier shelter and, in providing medication assisted treatment. So here for the programs, you provide shelter and Christian recovery. Here the programs is housing first plus methadone plus safe injections are your programs. So primary funding, private versus government, outcomes, spiritual, housing, job, sobriety, healthy relationships. And essentially here the outcomes are decreased deaths and decreased number of homeless people. So that's really how all these things combine together to come up with very different outcomes. So hopefully through this whole thing, you can see that what assumptions you use makes a big difference. And I think one of the main messages I'm trying to get across is using tools is great. Recognize when you use tools, they shape you, and try to create balanced muscles across various tools. And that'll help us to provide the best solutions to those we serve.